ذنبي عظيم ذنبي عظيم.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وأصلي وأسلم على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه والتابعين لهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. In the name of Allah, the Compassionate, the Merciful, all praise is due to Allah. And may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon His Prophet Muhammad, his family, his companions all, and his followers until the day of judgment. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I greet you with the greetings of peace. Peace be upon you. Now, continuing with the series of human rights, a Muslim perspective. I've already mentioned the history of the beginning of human rights movement in the West in particular, and we've talked about how that developed from the 13th century with the Magna Carta, and then reaching into the end of the 18th century. The 18th century would be considered as the century of human rights movements. Yes, indeed, because in France, for example, in the year 1789, the document for human rights and citizens in France was developed and issued, and then the French Constitution came out in 1791, again mentioning human rights, and then beginning with the human rights movement into the 20th century. We know that the first time human rights were mentioned in the United Nations, that was in 1919. And we could understand that because after the end of World War I, there was a need for all nations of the world to come to peace and to end war and the reasons for war. And they knew that the reason for war was the absence of justice and freedom, and there was a need to stop the violations of human rights. That's why human rights were emphasized in the Charter of the United Nations later on in 1945. But even before that, in 1941, the Atlantic document mentioned that. And then after 1945 and the Charter of the United Nations, in 1948, and specifically in the month of June, a drafting of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights was issued in order for states to study them and ratify them later. This what took place on December the 10th, 1948. So that is the day when 48 nations signed agreeing on this Universal Declaration of Human Rights in order to advance the human rights on the level of states and to teach citizens and people of the world their rights and the importance of getting these rights delivered to people and not to delay them, not to twist them, not to change them under any circumstances. That was the movement in that direction. Of course, there was some objection to this, particularly from the socialist countries, because it was drafted and it was moved and pushed by the Western Bloc, the Atlantic Bloc, if you will, as opposed to the socialist bloc in the Eastern Europe. But then, nonetheless, of course, many third world countries did not sign because they were afraid of using this as a political tool and also to challenge the traditional values found in these countries. So that discussion was there, and therefore it did not move fully with the agreement of everyone. Some countries had their own reservations, particularly about the changing of religion, and those are particularly the Muslim countries. And I mentioned Saudi Arabia in particular, which had some reservations regarding this particular point, because in Islam, once a Muslim has declared his faith, it is not possible for this person to declare his departure from this religion, because according to the Islamic rules, This is not permissible. Otherwise, changing a religion would be like a game. You can enter it today and leave it tomorrow. It is a serious matter, and we know that once a person has this conviction, it would not be possible for this person to leave. Obviously, we know that this has been the case, by the way, which provoked lots of controversy in the world and even through history before the coming of this Universal Declaration. But nonetheless, the movement went on, and of course, it had its influence on many countries in the world, and we know that some of them actually did abide by this, and to a great extent it was accepted because people after 2 world wars, the one which took place from 1914 until 1918 and the second one from 1939 to 1944, all of these wars which were actually destroying the whole world, and we've seen the consequences of what happened to these countries, where many countries were destroyed and many went through lots of suffering. And we know of the consequences of using the atomic bomb in Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan. In all of these terrible consequences, the world came to its senses and wanted to stop this. Yes, this is something that should be welcomed. Nonetheless, there are some things which would be of disagreement among the various nations based on their ideologies, based on their religions, cultural traditions, and so on. But we can find that all in all, there are some great agreements. There's a great agreement on many of the articles in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This declaration has 30 articles where they emphasize all the freedoms and responsibilities and the responsibility of the state in particular to defend the individual rights and the rights of the people in their own respective countries. And nations have to cooperate in this respect and respect those who are at disadvantage, like women, children, and old people. All this was taken into consideration. Now, the Muslim nations, in response to that, also wanted to draft their own Declaration of Human Rights. They started in the 70s and then in the 80s to just move on towards that direction. And in 1981, exactly on the 19th of September 1981, in a session for UNESCO, a draft for a universal Islamic Declaration for Human Rights was introduced. And then, of course, Muslims had to respond to this and to tell the world that even before the latest movements in human rights, Islam has come with an ideal human rights, constitution, and law, giving everyone, whether they would be a Muslim or non-Muslim, their own rights. That's what took place in that respect. Before this took place, obviously there were some work on developing some sources on this subject, where many books have been written during that period from the announcement of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and then about for a period of 30 years or more, lots of movements and many books have been written in different languages, particularly in Arabic, regarding this topic. And as I said, Muslims felt that we need to present our own version of human rights as opposed to the version presented by the Western Alliance and many countries who came along with that. The point is, everyone was after the prohibition of exploitation, of suppression, and injustice. And I think no one would disagree with that, because Islam stands for all of these rights of people against oppression, suppression, exploitation, injustice, humiliation. These are common and universal demands that we need to have installed in the world. But Islam has tied this to the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to believe that He is the source of these rights. It is based on the conviction that these rights are given by Allah and no one has any authority to take them back from us. This is the difference between what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has given and what is found in the Islamic law in this regard. No one has the authority by his own, by default, whether this be a Khalifa, a political leader, a government, a Shura Council, or a parliament. Anyone does not have the right to limit these rights of people, because it is Allah who has given us these rights, and no one whatsoever has the right to take them away from us. So there are some points in the Universal Declaration which are, of course, subject to controversy and dialogue and discussion among the various nations. It has been a subject of this since its own creation, and nowadays, after more than 50 years of the signing of this declaration, still we see lots of human rights violations in the world, even by the countries who signed this declaration. This is unfortunate because we still have this mentality of supremacy and the powerful exercising their own hegemony and influence upon the weak and those who are at a disadvantage in the world. I'll have more on this topic after a short break, so please stay around. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. Welcome back. We need to emphasize, since we're talking about human rights, the commonalities and differences between what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights presented and later on the Universal Islamic Declaration of Human Rights, which took place after this with about 33 years. Let me tell you first about what is contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where there was an emphasis on these important issues: the right to life, the right to freedom, the right to equality, to fair trial and judgment, the need for the protection from the abuse of power and those in authority, the protection of one's reputation and honor and family and lineage, the protection from torture, protection from any abuse of human beings, whether in child labor, for example, or anything similar to that. Also the right to participate in public life, the freedom of religion, and the freedom to believe in anything or anyone based on one's conviction, the freedom of thinking and the freedom of expression, the rights of people in their own intellectual rights or copyrights of what people produce, the freedom for residence in a country and the movement from one country to another, the freedom to have asylum and migration, giving minorities their own rights, the right also to build the family, and all the economic rights of a person to have a job, to earn decent livelihood, to have a family, and of course to have the rights and responsibilities based on having a family as the unit, the basic unit of any society, and the right of the individual in protecting his or her privacy. These were the common issues in any declaration of human rights. Any document on human rights would have to deal with this and would have to protect the individuals and communities from any abuse of their own rights based on giving them these basic rights. And of course, that would vary from one system to another, emphasizing in one system one point and limiting one particular right, as opposed to giving more rights in a particular area. But nonetheless, at least we'd have to have a minimum in these areas. But let me emphasize the Islamic point of view here, because the Organization of the Islamic Conference, OIC, which later on became the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, they produced a document which actually started as a Bill of Rights for the citizens of Muslim countries and for Muslims in general, and that at least is taken from the Islamic sources, from the Quran and the Sunnah throughout history. And let me explain that in details because it's important. We would agree with many of the documents of human rights produced in different forms in different countries and finally culminated by the issuance of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But then, talking about these rights in detail, first let me talk about the right to life. The right to life is very essential, and we know that Allah created us and He's the one who owns our lives. We, according to the Islamic belief, do not own our own bodies. It's a trust with us that Allah has entrusted us with, and we're keeping it in order to use this body and to live according to the Islamic rules. And that's very simple, because if you think about where you came from and where you're going to and what is the purpose of your presence in this life, that will simplify the answer to these questions. We came from Allah, we're returning to Allah, we're supposed to run our life according to what Allah wants from us. Just as simple as this. That's why no one has the right to take his life or to take someone else's life, to kill himself or to kill others, unless by a due process of law according to the Sharia and according to judgments issued by people who are in authority, and after reviewing the state of the affair and knowing if the person deserves to be in fact treated as a killer, and therefore this person would be killed because that is a response to what he did. Or if a person abandons his own religion based on no conviction, no doubts, because if a person is leaving Islam by his own choice, maybe this person would have some doubts, so this person will be given some time to review his issue and to have many sessions with this person and give this person some time to rethink his own decision. So this is not an easy thing, and it's not in the hands of anyone just to take the law into their own hands and to do whatever they want with the lives of others. Life is so important that even killing one person is like killing the whole of humanity. As Allah says in the glorious Quran, أَنَّهُ مَنْ قَتَلَ نَفْسًا بِغَيْرِ نَفْسٍ أَوْ فَسَادٍ فِي الْأَرْضِ فَكَأَنَّمَا قَتَلَ النَّاسَ جَمِيعًا وَمَنْ أَحْيَاهَا فَكَأَنَّمَا أَحْيَا النَّاسَ جَمِيعًا. That anyone killing another human being, a soul, without killing another one, meaning that this person killed because the application of the law of qisas, where whoever kills will be killed, or because of fasad or corruption on earth, such as the use of hiraba, the armed robbery, or that sort of crime. If a person was killed not because of these two major crimes or similar ones, then this person is resembled to killing the whole of humanity. And if a person saves life to another person, it is like he has saved life to all of humanity. And we know this from many, many examples, history, where the saving of a life is a source to enter paradise, even if that soul is not that of a human being, if it is even an animal, like a dog or a cat. In the very famous hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, دخلت النار امرأة في هرة لا هي أطعمتها ولا هي تركتها تأكل من خشاش الأرض. A woman was made to enter hellfire because of a cat that she kept, and she did not feed her, nor did she let her loose and go after her own food. Just keeping that cat to die was a cause for this woman to enter hellfire. And the same thing for another woman who was even committing one of the worst crimes, which is committing zina, fornication. She was selling her body, al-baghi. Now she noticed that there was a dog which was thirsty, and she saw that he was licking the ground, the mud, which was a bit wet, looking for any water. So she went down, she didn't have anything to put some water in. She took her shoes, she put some water in her shoes for that dog, and Allah forgave her for what she did. All of her crimes and whatever she was doing, she was forgiven because of saving the life of that dog and giving water to that dog. So life is so precious in Islam for any human being, whether this is a Muslim or non-Muslim. And no life shall be taken except by the direction of the law and the judgment of the law under the Islamic banner. I need to stop here, but I'll continue inshallah in the coming episode with more on human rights, a Muslim perspective. Until then, I leave you with Allah's care and protection. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
يا واسع العفو يا واسع العفو والغفران والكرم قد جئت مرتجفا من زلة القدم ذنبي عظيم ذنبي عظيم ذنبي عظيم وأرجو منك مغفرة يا ذا الجلال ويا ذا الجود والكرم